My family have always been nomads. It's probably the Scandinavian blood in us, or so my grandmother always said. She was Swedish and always told tales of Viking explorer blood running through the family veins. She and my grandfather moved to the U.S. in the early 1930s. A few years after becoming a U.S. citizen, my mother was born, and in subsequent years my aunt and uncle. When my mother was 18, my grandfather passed away. Grandma never remarried, but as far back as I can remember, my brothers and I always kept in contact with her. You recall I mentioned my family was nomadic. Well, I meant it. My uncle moved to Canada after marrying, and my aunt to Washington State in the U.S. My family, being military, moved from state to state in the U.S., but as often as we could, we would visit Grandma, and at least a dozen times a year I spoke to her over the phone. Even during my teenage years, when I really couldn't care less about anyone but myself. When I graduated from high school, I had some time off before starting college and got the idea to go stay with my grandmother for a few months. Never before had any of my family spent so much time with Grandma, but I wanted to. She always had the best stories, and she and I had a connection I can honestly say no one else in my family seemed to have with her. She was elated when I told her the news, and so I made arrangements to visit her in her state of Utah. Seeing her again was so wonderful. We talked endlessly and played copious amounts of Scrabble, and for nearly a month I helped her with chores, errands, and minor repairs around her home. But it was around this time that I began noticing odd behavior from Grandma. She spoke to me less and less. At times it was as though she literally seemed to forget I was there. I wasn't home much of the time, mind you. I would sightsee and socialize, but spent a balanced amount of time visiting and socializing with Grandma as well. Her behavior was odd, but I mostly passed it off as her being set in her ways, and now that the newness of me being there was wearing off, I simply assumed this was her normal routine, solitary, reclusive, not wanting to be bothered. I acclimated to the new routine and only spoke to Grandma when she seemed so inclined. Another month went by and I was spending less and less time at home, as I had made new friends in the area and was a teenager after all, but even being gone as much as I was, I still noticed disturbing changes in Grandma whenever I was there in the house with her. She almost never spoke to me. I mean, not even eye contact. Often I would ask her if she needed anything from the store or for me to help with any housework, but she would not respond, not even a glance in my direction. Looking back, if I would have been older, I probably would have done more and reacted differently, but being 18, I continued to mostly accept the strange behavior, until things became much worse. By the third month, the new normal was Grandma in seclusion, ignoring almost everything I said, and did, and almost never seeing one another. It was at this point I began thinking it may be time for me to return home. Perhaps this was how Grandma lived while alone, or maybe it was her way of letting me know it was time to go. I decided I would make plans to leave in a week. The next morning, I got out of bed, showered, and headed to the kitchen to speak to Grandma about my plans to leave. But she wasn't in the kitchen. So I checked her room to see if she was still sleeping, but she wasn't there either. I ended up checking the entire house and could not find her anywhere. I was about to look outside when I heard a bizarre thumping sound. It was a few thumps followed by pounding. It sounded like it was coming from inside the walls. I tried following the sounds and after a few minutes traced them into my grandma's room. As I entered the room, I was baffled to see my grandmother sitting in her rocking chair, chatting pleasantly to herself and rocking back and forth. I called out, "Grandma, are you okay?" She didn't look at me but answered, "Oh yes, we're fine. We're just fine." It was then that I noticed white powder on the shoulders of her blouse and on her knees as well. The powder looked like drywall powder. I asked her, "Grandma, were you doing something behind the walls?" but she just kept rocking, completely ignoring me, still chatting away to herself with a warm smile on her face and a blank stare. Grandma had said, "We are just fine." We? My grandmother was always coherent and alert, but for the first time, I worried if maybe she was having the onset of dementia. A few hours went by, and I spent the time researching dementia symptoms online. When I realized how much time had passed, I got up to go check on Grandma. As I left my room and entered the hall, I immediately heard talking. This time I heard multiple voices. I was relieved. Obviously, one or more of Grandma's friends had finally come to visit her. I walked briskly to her room with a smile on my face, ready to greet our new guests. But when I made the turn from the hall into her room, Grandma was in bed. She was asleep but breathing heavily. I could hear her deep, labored breaths. Where were the voices coming from? Now, listening for them, they had all stopped. I thought it was very weird, but then in the silence I heard the squealing of children playing across the street, and quickly convinced myself that that was the voices I had heard. There was no other explanation. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept having nightmares of going into my grandma's room and finding her dead in her bed. So I lay awake in bed just resting, staring at the ceiling. After maybe an hour, I began to hear my grandmother's voice. At first she seemed to be talking to someone, but then it became shouting. I jumped out of bed and jogged down the hall to her room. The door was ajar, so I pushed it open and called out, "Grandma, what's going on?" What I saw made me afraid to be in that house for the first time ever. My grandma was on her knees as if praying. She was facing the window, looking up and out into the moonlight. The moon lit her face perfectly, and I could see she had tears streaming down her face and looked very frustrated. The best way to describe her appearance would be that of a person on their knees praying so hard but appearing mournful, as though their prayers were not being answered. I called out one more time, "Grandma, are you okay?" But she acted as though she could not hear me and continued grumbling and shouting occasional accusations at the window. Seeing her this way disturbed me greatly, but I didn't know what to do, so I returned to bed. I didn't sleep at all, and neither did Grandma. All through the night she yelled. At some point, though, I must have gotten exhausted and fell asleep, because I woke to daylight and silence. I got up and checked on Grandma. She was asleep, breathing deeply under her blanket. I decided to take a shower, and after drying off and dressing, I left the bathroom and noticed what looked like blood on the carpet in the hall. A lot of blood. It trailed all the way down the hall and into my room. I began shouting out for my grandmother as I raced down the hall, and as I turned into my room, I saw my grandma's legs hanging out of the closet. Blood was everywhere. I ran to her and tried to pull her from the closet, but quickly realized she was halfway into a crawl space trying to get behind the walls. I pulled with all my might, screaming, "Grandma, please come out. We have to get to the hospital." But in response, all I heard was a muffled scream behind the wall saying, "He's waiting for me. I have to go. Let me go." She was too far into the crawl space, and I knew if I didn't get help fast, she was going to bleed out. I sprinted to my phone and called 911. Within about 10 to 15 minutes, an ambulance arrived, and I let them in. It took all three of us to get her out from behind the wall, but when we finally did, we saw deep cuts on her arms, apparently from glass. My grandmother was so weak at this point, she could barely put up a struggle, and the paramedics took her to the hospital. They told me the name of the hospital and asked me if I wanted to come with them. Honestly, I was in such a state of shock, I must have said no, because they left without me. I walked the house in a daze. I went from room to room. Part of me thinking, there must be someone else here. Grandma was definitely talking to someone. While the other part of me said, Grandma is suffering from dementia. There's no one here. It was a hallucination in her mind. I eventually made my way to Grandma's room, and there I saw the broken window. She must have hit it with both hands, and it cut deep into her arms. I felt so ashamed. How could I have slept through her episode? I didn't even remember when I fell asleep. She was wounded all night, and I did nothing. I felt such anguish and disappointment in myself. I broke down crying and called my parents. My parents flew to Utah the next day, and I met them at the hospital. The doctors explained my grandmother was having transient ischemic attacks, more commonly known as mini strokes, for at least the past couple of months. These mini strokes can cause major cellular damage in the brain and in some cases lead to audio-visual hallucinations. The doctor said my grandmother would fully recover and with medication would most likely never have another episode like this again. My parents arranged for my grandma to live in an assisted living home, and I still talk to her semi-regularly. She doesn't remember any of the scary parts, and I still feel a sense of guilt over falling asleep and not being able to talk to her with the same love and tenderness after the events that I used to. But the shock and horror of seeing how fragile the human mind is and how reality can alter for someone in the span of a few minutes has changed me forever. I do my best to treat my grandma the same as I had before, but she notices I'm changed. I tell her, yes, I'm changed, but I still love you. But I can't stop thinking about the words of the doctor at the hospital when he said there is a high probability that the hereditary factors leading to Grandma's condition could happen to me when I'm older.